Right now, David Cole is a veteran industry analyst and chairman of the Center for Automotive Research. He joins us from Ann Arbor, Michigan, with his reaction to the auto news and really his take on the situation in general. Let me ask you first, David, how you think the government has handled this so far. I mean, a lot of people have argued GM should have gone into bankruptcy a long time ago. But, of course, there are political concerns, extremely large political concerns, that I've just been talking about with Greg. How do you think the government's done?
Well, you know, it's, I think, a mixed grade I would give him at this point. To begin with, and it's not a political thing. Republicans and Democrats at the policy level don't understand the role that manufacturing plays in our economy, and they certainly don't understand the auto industry. You can't look at it as just a financial puzzle, and that's primarily, I think, what has been done up to this point because of its complexity. GM, and in fact, the auto industry is the most complex industry by far in our economy, in fact, in the world's economy. And if we have, with this very tightly woven supply base that underlies this industry, a major failure, for example, if the GM bankruptcy goes bad, could cause a cascading failure that takes the entire industry down and could really the industry, by the way, is in a depression. This is not a recession in the auto industry, and it could trigger potentially a recession or depression in the overall economy. So it's a very high-risk game, and it's a game where the people that are calling the shots really don't have great depth of knowledge, and that's kind of scary.
Are you saying it could still cause a depression in the U.S. economy? And we've seen already pretty much the winding down of this industry, have we not?
Well, it's sort of the restructuring of GM followed on the restructuring of Chrysler. And the impact in terms of the number of jobs in this industry, and we're already beginning to see that with some of the plant shutdowns, the dealer shutdowns. For example, the typical dealer has about 50 employees. They have a multiplier of about 3, which means there are about 150 people impacted in all these communities. And that's where all of a sudden now the whole country saw this as other than just a Midwest or a Detroit problem. It's really a national problem. And it is of the scale and with a high enough multiplier and with the fragility of the supply structure that underlies this industry. If we get into a cascading failure, the depression of the auto industry could really spread to a depression in the overall economy because of the fragility generally of the economy right now. We're in a very tense and scary period where hopefully things will go smooth. A clean bankruptcy is absolutely necessary. If this goes out of control, we're going to have big problems.
David, Greg Miles here. You talked about
yes,
a clean bankruptcy. How concerned are you that intervention by congressmen such as Barney Frank and also by other congressmen to protect dealerships is going to slow this bankruptcy, delay it beyond that 60 to 90-day goal, or even render the bankruptcy inefficient because all the cuts don't get done?
Oh, that is a risk, and I think this was a risk from the beginning when the government got involved, that politics would begin to play a more and more important role, and we're already beginning to see that. It's kind of a wild, wild west here in Detroit right now in terms of how this is all going to unfold. But you have to realize that this industry is so complex in terms of the parties. We've just talked about dealers. We've talked about plants that are spread across the country. In the Boston area, it's a warehouse with 80-some employees. But you've got suppliers, you've got now the government, you've got bondholders, shareholders, and you've got a worldwide enterprise that's in a very fragile situation. And if we get to a tipping point, this could be a really serious problem. And political intervention beyond what has already occurred could really take this out and make it a much bigger mess than it already is. And that's one of the uncertainties once politicians get involved.
You know what, I'm going to ask you just to stay with us, if you would, for a moment, David. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I'm going to ask you what you think about legal intervention. What happens if legal precedent gets involved here? Is the Supreme Court going to hear Chrysler bondholders' case? And what does that mean for General Motors? Stay with us here on Bloomberg. We're back in 2 minutes. All right, we are back with David Cole of the Center for Automotive Research. And, David, just, you know, getting headlines across about the Supreme Court being asked to hear the case from the secured debt holders in case of Chrysler. Are you concerned if a little thing like the law gets involved with these bankruptcies? Does that change things?
Well, it certainly could. The bankruptcy judge in these two cases, Chrysler and GM, are really independent, and they can choose to hear what they want to hear and not hear what they don't want to hear. But it's all up to the courts. And with the complexity of this industry, the complexity of General Motors, it's the kind of thing that raises a level of uncertainty. It's one of the reasons that we had hoped, looking at this, that they were able to resolve this outside of bankruptcy, because it really adds a level of complexity and uncertainty that can be very difficult to deal with.
David, Greg Miles here. I wanted to clarify, you still seem to think that the U.S. auto industry and their suppliers, General Motors, Chrysler, the suppliers, are in danger of essentially collapsing as if there were no support from the U.S. government. Are you saying that that could still occur even with $62 billion in government aid and even with these fast-track bankruptcy plans? It's still a risk?
Absolutely. If the supply structure to this industry is tightly interwoven, you take major, say, engineered component suppliers that will supply 8 or 10 different auto companies. These suppliers, many of the critical ones, are right at the edge of the cliff. And if we have, say, a shutdown or a collapse of GM, that could take them down, which could then take all of the manufacturers down, both the internationals and the domestics that are producing here. And that's been a risk all along, that this kind of thing would happen. In fact, we did a report, it's on our website of cargroup.org, looking at a clean versus messy bankruptcy. And the messy bankruptcy really adds to the complexity of our problems at a national level very, very quickly. And we just don't know how this is going to come out. Our hope, obviously, and as you talked to Fritz earlier, is that it's a clean and precise and nicely packaged bankruptcy. But with all of the variables that are in play here, and we're talking about some here in the past few minutes, this can go out of control very, very quickly. It is very much dependent on how the courts handle it.
One thing to clarify, you know, one survey showed that, that a third of the auto supply companies felt they were on the brink of Chapter 11 by the end of the second quarter, and about 2/3 of them were on the brink by year end, at the way things were going.
That's correct.
Did you agree with that? Is it that dire?
It's a very serious problem in the supply structure. We really have two kinds of suppliers. You have what we would call a commodity supplier. You could move tools over a weekend and begin production at somebody else's plant. But then you have the engineered component suppliers. This might be software. It might be something like a power steering system or a suspension system. That's a whole different deal. And because of how tightly integrated these suppliers are into the industry, at one level they're very robust and strong. It's one of the reasons there's so much value creation in the auto industry. At another level, they're very, very fragile. And that fragility, we think of that as sort of a bottom-up failure of the industry that could be precipitated by, say, a failure of a GM or a Chrysler. But it's invisible. We don't see that because we don't see the names of suppliers in our headlines. We see the names of cars and companies, but that supply structure is in very deep trouble. And if it begins to collapse, and we have a number of suppliers that are already in Chapter 11, but if this collapses in a major way, it creates an immense problem in our economy, not just for the auto industry.
You know, you're painting the auto industry almost as a scary avalanche type situation for the country. Shouldn't we wind something like this down if it's so complex and there's so many multipliers involved? Shouldn't there be some way where you can go and precision dynamite the way that you would do with an avalanche to try and wind it down?
We wish it were that simple, but this has been built up over 100 years. The complexity is built in. The value creation in this industry is enormous. For example, the average job at an auto manufacturer creates about 3 times the value of the average job of the average worker in our economy. Everybody in the world is competing for these jobs, and we are the only country, and we've talked to many of the countries around the world, the so-called industrialized countries. We are the only country that at the political level, policy level, does not have a comprehensive understanding of the role that manufacturing plays in our economy, nor particularly for the auto industry. And so, in a sense, what you have are people that have a limited level of understanding of this very complex industry being involved in decisions that can have a profound impact ultimately on our economy. It's a very dangerous state. A number of years ago, for example, a couple of congressmen that I was talking to said, well, we were talking about fuel economy issues, and said, well, there's a limitation in the second law of thermodynamics. It says when energy is converted from one form to another, you always create waste. He says, well, why don't we just pass a new second law of thermodynamics? And I wish it were that simple, but it is not. This industry is a foundation industry in our economy. And we, frankly, and this is not political on either side, both sides, both the Republicans and the Democrats, are basically rookies in terms of trying to understand this industry. The people in this industry have tried to express themselves through the products of the industry. They don't talk about what's going on, and until very recently, there's been very limited interest on the part of the government in the role that manufacturing plays in the economy. Now they're beginning to understand that it's pretty important, and they better figure out how to do something before we have a catastrophe.
David, what do you suggest? I mean, it doesn't seem like Rick Wagner had the best understanding of the industry either, and he's been working in it for so long. What can you say? There's an industry where you've given the suppliers such wafer-thin margins that they're on the precipice of going out of business at any time. At the same time, when you drive the product off the lot, it's worth 20% less than it was 30 seconds ago.
Well, yeah, one of the problems is, and I would say this applies pretty much to the Eastern media, probably the Western media, as well as to the political world, is the abysmal level of ignorance on this industry. I can tell you Rick Wagner had a very sophisticated understanding of this industry. People weren't really willing to listen and have not listened. And that's one of the problems that we have. The complexity of this business is overwhelming. And I admire the task force. They're very smart people. They have a financial background primarily.
David?
And they're trying to do a crash course in a couple of months of what people have had to learn over maybe 30 and 40 years.
David, Greg Miles here. Several experts have told me, including Dennis Virag, that the auto supply industry needs an additional $30 to $50 billion in U.S. aid on top of $5 billion to get them through this. Do you agree?
That's very possible. It's an industry that is largely invisible in Washington, and it's right at the edge of the cliff. And as I said earlier, the risk of a bottom-up bankruptcy in this industry is very real, which would shut everybody down. I mean, not just GM, Ford, and Chrysler, but Toyota, Honda, Nissan, everybody. And that shock to our economy is, if it were to occur, if we were to have, say, a messy bankruptcy, could trigger a really serious problem in the economy.
Or maybe, David, we just need Toyota and Honda executives to come over and run these companies for us. Because it seems like...
Doesn't make any difference. You could think that they're the smartest people in the world, and they're scared to death. Toyota right now is about at the amount of capital it needs to run. Just on exchange rate shift in the last year in Japan, the shift in the yen to dollar has cost Toyota billions of dollars.
All right,
it's an unbelievable period in this industry.
Got to take a break. David, thanks so much for joining us. David